In this demonstration, I'll explain to you how to install Node.js, which is the main prerequisite for us to work with the Angular. So before I show you the installation process of Node.js, first of all, let's try to understand why do we even require Node.js when we have to develop applications using Angular. The reason is many of the tools used for Angular development rely on pretty much on the Node.js. So that means we definitely have to have Node.js in place if we have to work with the Angular. In fact, Node.js was created in the year 2009, which is basically a runtime for the server-side applications written in JavaScript. So we all know that normally when we write JavaScript code inside an HTML page, it is the browser with the help of the JavaScript compiler, it executes the JavaScript code in the browser's context. So running JavaScript code inside a browser's context is not pretty strange. It's pretty normal stuff for all of us. But what is new for us is how do we run JavaScript code outside of the browser's context? So that is where Node.js will help us. So this point clearly explains the same thing that I have just explained. So Node.js is based on the JavaScript engine used in many of the different browsers, and it provides an API for executing the JavaScript code outside of the browser environment. So that's where we require Node.js. Also, we have to have Node.js to use the NPM, which is basically used to download the dependencies for our Angular applications. And NPM will be automatically available to you once you install the Node.js on your computer. So NPM stands for the Node Package Manager. So using this NPM, we will be able to download the different supporting dependencies or modules that are pretty much used inside the Angular development. Now the point here is we now understood why do we require Node.js. Now the second point that we need to understand is which version of Node.js should I install for which version of Angular. Obviously different versions of Angular expects different versions of Node.js. So to explain that, I have provided a link here. So when I click on this link, I'm going to explain to you the version compatibility that is required for the different versions of Angular. So as you can see, upon clicking that link, this is the page that gets opened for you right from the Angular 1.0 till the latest version of 13.3.0. This page clearly explains which version of Node.js is required, which version of TypeScript is required, or which version of the RxJS version. Currently, my focus is pretty much on the Angular version, the Node.js version, TypeScript version, and then the Angular CLI version. So you can go through this chart to explain, to figure out which version of these things we have to install. Currently, I'm pretty much focusing on the 13.3.0 Angular CLI, that is the Angular version. So it is expecting above 12 or above 14 or above 16. So this caret sign basically tells you greater than. So I can go for 12, 14 or 16 for the Node.js, and for the TypeScript it can be anywhere between 4.4 to 4.7. And of course for the RxJS version is from 6.5 to 7.4.0. So if you can see, the Angular version 12 expects the Node.js to be either 12 or 14, above 12 or above 14. So that is how this clearly explains which version of Node.js or which version of the TypeScript we are supposed to install to work with the Angular applications. So that is how in this example I've shown you why do we require Node.js and which version of Node.js we have to install. Now it's time for us to go back to the website nodejs.org. And when you visit the nodejs.org website, so you can download, obviously the most preferred one is the LTS. So when I click on 16.15.0, now I'm downloading the Node installer, and then I'm going to run this file, and I'm going to simply complete this installation process. So I'm going to click on next and then accept the agreement, and click on next again. and then where would you like to install this one. So I'm going to click on next. Now the most important thing here, when you expand the npm package manager, so this will be installed, and of course add to path is also important for you, so that you will be able to run the commands from the Node.js command prompt anywhere from your command prompt. So that is the main thing. And then simply click on next, and then next again, and click on install. So within a couple of seconds Node.js will be installed. So once the Node.js is successfully installed, we will verify which version we have installed by going to the Node.js command prompt and and then we'll try to find out which version of npm or which version of Node has got installed on your system. So let's wait till the installation process gets over. So now you can see Node.js has been installed successfully. I'm going to click on finish and simply go back to the search prompt and search for the Node.js command prompt, and then simply you can pin this Node.js command prompt to your taskbar, and I'm going to click on the Node.js command prompt, and I'm going to find out by just typing node -- version. So that basically tells me I have 16.15.0, and of course if I search for npm -- version, so that should tell me which version of npm you have. Of course we also have a different option, like you can type just node -v instead of typing -- version. Similarly you can type npm -v, so that will show you the node package manager version that is installed. So these commands are pretty much available as part of these training slides. So that is how in this lecture I have explained to you why do we need Node.js for Angular, and which version of Node is supposed to be installed to work with which version of Angular. In this lecture I'm going to show you how to install TypeScript by using the npm, the Node Package Manager. So why do we require TypeScript to work with Angular applications is because the code that we write for Angular applications development is by using TypeScript itself. In fact, Angular itself was written using TypeScript. So we can simply run the command npm install -global TypeScript at the Node.js command prompt to install the TypeScript. And once it is installed successfully, you can type tsc -- version to find out which version of TypeScript has got installed. So let's go back to the Node.js command prompt, and I'm going to simply type npm install -global and then followed by TypeScript, and then press enter. Now this is going to install TypeScript for you. In fact, instead of using -global, you may as well use the -g. So changed one package and audited two packages in 5 seconds. Everything looks okay to me. Now if I say tsc -- version, now you can see I have TypeScript installed 4.6.4. So that is how so far we have installed two different prerequisites. One is the Node.js itself. Now we have just installed the TypeScript. In this lecture, we're going to install the Angular CLI package, where CLI stands for the command line interface. So why do we require Angular CLI package and how do we install it is what I'm going to cover in this lecture. So first of all, the Angular CLI package has become the standard way for creating and managing the Angular projects during the development. Some people do ask me, like, is it very essential to have the Angular CLI? The answer is not pretty much required. Even there are some people who can create the Angular projects from scratch by creating their own folders and then downloading the dependencies. You can do all these things manually. But the problem here it's a lengthy process, and then it is an error-prone process. So that is why most of the time people will pretty much use the Angular CLI package. So the Angular CLI package simplifies the process of creating and managing the Angular projects. So we can simply use the command npm install -global, or you can type just -g at angular/CLI. So if you use this command, this is going to install the latest version of the Angular CLI. but for any specific reason or requirement you want to install a specific version of CLI, then you should say npm install -g at angular/CLI at and followed by the version that you require. So now let's go back to the Node.js command prompt. So now I'm at the Node.js command prompt, and then I'm going to simply run the command npm install -global at angular/CLI. Now this will take some time to install the Angular CLI, the command line interface. So once this is installed, we will be able to run different commands to build your Angular solutions or execute or run your Angular solutions. So once this is installed, you can simply run the command ng-version, and then it should show me the version of the Angular CLI that has been installed. So you can see it is 13.3.5 and Node is 16.15.0 and the npm is 8.5.5. So that is how, in this example, I've shown you how to install the Angular CLI. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how we can uninstall Angular CLI. Now, first of all, why do we have to uninstall Angular CLI? So probably, let's say you have a different version currently on your system, but you're looking for a new version. So ideally, it's not a good practice that you simply install the latest version or the next version of Angular CLI when you already have an existing Angular CLI installed on your system. So the best thing is to uninstall it cleanly and then reinstall the next version of Angular CLI. So for this, you're going to run a command npm uninstall -g at angular/CLI, and this is going to uninstall the version that you currently have on your system. But by just running this command, though you are successful in uninstalling, sometimes there may be some temporary files that are in the cache, and that may still create some kind of problem for you when you go for the next version of the Angular CLI. So that is why you can always run the command npm cache verify after you run the npm uninstall. So let's go to Node.js command prompt and try out these two commands. So as you can see now, I'm at the Node.js command prompt, and then I'm going to simply run the command npm uninstall -g at angular/CLI. So now if I use the command ng -version, so you can see now it is telling me ng is not a valid command because you have uninstalled the Angular/CLI package. So even though it is successfully uninstalled, but I want to verify that I'm not having any files in the cache. So I'm going to run the next command npm cache verify, and now the cache was verified and compressed, content verified, content garbage, index entries finished. So you can see this npm cache verify has cleaned up all the temporary files that might be existing on your system even after the Angular CLI has been uninstalled. So obviously, because I have just uninstalled, I will use my arrow keys, and then I'm going to install the Angular CLI one more time for you. So the option -global, you can also type it as npm install -g itself. Now if I use my arrow keys and then if I go for the ng version, now you can see the 13.3.5 Angular CLI has been installed. So that is how in this lecture I have explained to you how to install and how to uninstall the Angular CLI. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how we can create components in our Angular applications in many ways. Like I explained in the previous lecture, you can create components both as inline templating as well as code behind components. In fact, you can also create components in an easy way by using the Angular CLI. So I'm going to show you all the three options in this lecture. So you can notice here I'm inside D drive, and I'm having a folder called as Angular exercises, which is basically now at this point of time it's an empty folder. So first of all, I'm going to create a new component by saying ng, a new application, sorry. I'm going to say ng new, and then I'm going to call my application as creating components in many ways demo, and then I press enter. So as soon as you run this special command to create the Angular application, so first of all it is asking you, would you like to add the routing functionality for this application? We'll talk about routing a bit later, so for the time being I'm going to say no. And which style sheet format would you like to use? I'm happy to use the CSS for the time being, and then I click on enter. So now it is going to create a brand new empty application for you. So by default, the Angular CLI, when we use the command ng-new application name, it is going to create one module, and then it is going to create one default component called as app. So app will be your root component, or what we call it as a top level component. Now the purpose of this lecture is obviously to create further components by ourselves. So we don't want to really concentrate too much on the app component at this stage. Rather, I would like you to concentrate on creating your own custom components. Now if I see the directory, I can see there is a new folder that got created for my application, which is creating components in many ways demo. Now let me switch to that folder, and then if I see the directory, you can see there are plenty of folders, and this is where we're going to create our own components. So I'm going to type code dot to open this application inside the Visual Studio Code. And as soon as this application is open, you can see under the SRC folder, by default, there is a folder called as app. And inside the app folder, we have the app component, which is already present. In fact, if I simply go here, and then if I say ng build to compile the solution, and then if I say ng serve or ng run, it is going to host our application on a default port number called as 4200. So currently I'm just trying to build my solution, and you can see very well that we do not have any compilation errors. So that is what we need to verify before you run it. So I'm going to say ng serve, and then when I press enter, now the default HTTP web server is going to host our application on some port number. So now I can see the message here. So currently I can test my application by accessing the 4200. So if I can go back to my browser, and then if I say localhost :4200, and this is the output, you are basically getting it from the app component. So currently app is, as I said, it's a top level component or the root component which bootstraps your application. But currently I'm not really very much interested in understanding how these messages are coming up, so what they did inside that app component, all those things. In fact, you can see if you wanted to create new components, you can say ng generate component and then component name in case if you wish to create further components. So now we're going to see how I can create components in many ways, and how I can have multiple components on the same page, or how I can put one component inside another component. All these things we're going to see that. So I can go back to my Node.js command prompt, and then I can press Ctrl+C to stop the hosting of the application on this port number. So let's go back to Visual Studio, and here we're going to create our very first component. So obviously the focus in this lecture is going to be on the inline component. In the next lecture I'm going to show you about the code behind component, and then later I will show you how to create the component using the Angular CLI. So first of all, inside my app folder, I'm going to create a subfolder, something like, say, my own custom components. So let's call this as components. So inside the components folder, I want to create another folder for my component. So let's call this as inline component, and then I press enter. So inside the inline component folder, I'm going to create a new file. Let's call this as inline component.ts. So now you can see we have the brand new TypeScript file, call it as inline component.ts. So here I'm going to create my own component. So currently our application is only having the app component, but we are now planning to have our own component. So why am I calling it as inline component? So as I explained in my previous lecture in the PowerPoint slides, so every component will have a selector, or what do we call it as a directive, means how do we use that component in an HTML page, and every component will also have the HTML, the view, which is your HTML body content, and of course the third one is the CSS functionality. So when I say inline component, means the selector definition and then the HTML body content and then the CSS styling, everything you do in the same file. So that's why we call it as inline component. So let's see, how do I create a new component here? So before I start implementing the code, first of all, let me actually try to rename this file. By mistake I gave it as inline hyphen, so it's better. As per the convention, it has to be like inline.component.ts. so if you can notice, the app.component.ts, in the same way I'm having it as inline.component.ts. So at the end of the day, every component in your Angular is nothing but a class. So I'm going to create a new class like this. So you can see here class, and then I'm giving my class name something like, say, inline component, and obviously you have to export your component so that it can be imported in the other areas of your application. So exporting your class is really very important. Now inside this class, I'm just defining one property called as message of the data type string, and then I'm giving some static message, something like hello world. This is my first inline Angular component. So once your class is ready, so now we need to decorate this class with a special directive, call it as add component. So for that you need to import component. So first of all, I'm going to import my component interface from the @angular/core module. So this is an inbuilt module in your Angular library, and from there you're importing the component interface. Now whatever class that you have created for your Angular component, it must be identified with a special decorator, call it as add component. So just above my class name, I'm going to say add component, and then I open the parenthesis and then the flower braces. Now this is what we call as a decorator or a type decorator. Now this is marking your class as an Angular component. Now inside this component decorator, because whenever we are using the curly braces, it means it's an object, so it is expecting a bunch of properties. So the first property that you need to specify is what is the selector name that you wish to use, and then you also have to specify the template URL, and then finally you need to specify the styles URL. So this is how every inline component that you create will have a selector, will have a template URL, and then will have the style URLs. But in reality, I'm not actually going to create any HTML in a different web page, or I'm not going to create any styles in a different CSS file. So in reality, if you are looking for a code behind component, you normally specify template URL and then you specify the style URLs. But in this demonstration, because I'm purely focusing on the inline component but not on the code behind component, I don't want to go for a template URL. The reason is we have not created the HTML file in a different file, and then in the same way I'm looking to implement my CSS inside the same TypeScript file. So first of all, I wanted to give my selector name something like, say, app/inline. app-inline. Now remember, your component name, you're calling it as inline, so obviously the word component is mandatory in the latest versions of Angular. That means the word component should be suffixed to your class name. But the selector name need not be similar to the class name. It can be any custom name of your choice. But remember that your component name, whatever you're creating, before that, before the hyphen, you put the root component name, which is the app. The reason is we are trying to have the app as the top level component. That means inside the app component we would like to have the inline component. So that is why I'm going to give my selector name as app-inline. Now as far as the template is concerned, so this is where you can do all your HTML stuff inside the backtick. So you can see I'm pressing the backtick, which is quite below your escape key, and here you can specify all your HTML. So the HTML for the template is pretty simple. As you can see, I just have two h1 tags and then one h3 tag. So the first h1 tag is telling me that welcome to Angular 13 development, or hello world, this is my first inline Angular component. So when we render our component, we are expected to see these two messages. Of course, I wanted to see the value of this message property here. So in Angular we have the binding. So for bindings we have to use the flower braces, a pair of flower braces followed by the property name that you wish to access. So the reason why I'm trying to explain you here is because in the first two instances we are printing some hard-coded static messages. So maybe here our component is maintaining a property with some value. Now this value should be printed here dynamically, unlike having these messages in a static way here. So that is how I am done with my template here. Now the next one is obviously about the styles. Now when you are specifying the styles, Angular expects you to specify an array of styles. So that is why I'm opening the square brackets. Now inside the styles, I'm going to simply apply some CSS for the h1 tag as well as for h3 tag. So you can see here inside the square brackets I have opened a single quotes, and then the single quotes is closed here. And then I'm going to apply some CSS for my h1 element. So the syntax is whatever element name for which you want to apply CSS, and then open the flower braces and then close the flower braces. If you wish to apply CSS for multiple elements, yes, you can put a comma after the first element, and then the second element in flower braces you can have multiple properties. So here I was trying to explain you setting values to multiple CSS properties, and here only for one property we are giving the value. So for the h1 I'm saying the font weight as bold, font style as italic, text decoration as underline, and then the fore color is blue. So you can notice every CSS property is terminated by semicolon. So as far as my h3 tag is concerned, the fore color I'm going to specify it as red. So that is how in our very first example we have implemented our very first inline Angular component, or what we call it as inline templating. So that means in the same TS file you are concentrating on the views, you are also concentrating on the CSS, like that. Notice if you look at the app component, this Angular CLI created app.component.html, which will basically contain the same thing what I did inside the template, and they created app.component.css, so that's where they have the CSS. So obviously when you're going for the inline components or inline templating, it is not pretty much reusable or maintainable, because but if you feel like you don't use this component very often, and you don't expect so many changes will happen over the course of action, then you can go for the inline component. But obviously in real time people expect you to use the code behind component. But at least we should know in the initial days of learning Angular that it is possible that a single TS file, single TypeScript file, can take care of the presentation. It can also take care of the styles. So that is how we are done with our very first inline component. So now how do I use this here? So if I can take you to the app.module.ts, so because this is the module that actually kickstarts when you run your application. So why the app module.ts will come into picture is because the very first file that gets executed is the main.ts. So in the main.ts they are making a call to the Bootstrap module by passing the app module name, and this app module is nothing but this one. So inside this app module they are basically importing the app component. So now I have to import my own component which I have just created, is the inline component. Fortunately, Visual Studio Code is very user friendly. Like when you type the component name and you press the tab key, it automatically gives you the path of the component. So after you take that into the import statement, into the declarations also you need to take your inline component. So you need to put a comma followed by the second component name of your choice. Now the most important thing here is the Bootstrap. Now by default the app.module is starting the app component, so that is why you're seeing the output from the app component. But for the time being I'm not really giving very high importance to this output, because it is just a sample of the top level root component that those guys have created as a guideline. So I don't like this app component here anymore, so I'm going to import simply I'm going to bootstrap my inline component. Perfect. So that's the change that you need to make inside the app module.ts. And then the final thing here is in the index.html, because we know at the end of the day Angular is a single page application development. So the page that actually gets opened in the browser is the index.html. So by default the output what you are seeing here in the app component is coming from the app.component.html. And if you notice in the app.component.ts, those guys gave the selector name as AppRoot. So that's why in the index.html page they are using the AppRoot. So now I'm going to press Ctrl KC because I'm not interested in looking at the app components output. Rather, I'm more interested in looking at my inline component. So what's my component name is app inline. So why it is app inline, if you can see in the inline.component.ts, I gave the name as app-inline. So whatever is the selector name that you gave in the component creation, the same name you have to use here. Perfect. So we're done with our very first demonstration. So let's go back to Node.js command prompt and go for a ng build just to ensure that everything is good. And after that we are going to serve it in the browser. So this time when we test our application, it is supposed to open my app inline component. So I'm going to say ng serve at my Node.js command prompt, and as soon as your application is hosted onto the port number 4200, so I can go back to my browser, and this time when I refresh you can see the output that you are getting is from the inline component. So if we can very well verify what we did, so this is what we did. So I can see welcome to Angular 13 development. I can see hello world, this is my first inline Angular component, and I'm getting the value of my message property which was given as your components property. Hello world, this is my first inline Angular component. You can see this I'm printing it through H3, and H3 is having a color of red, whereas the first two messages are coming with the font weight as bold, font style as italic, text decoration as underline, and of course the color I gave it as blue. So these two messages are coming with the help of this CSS, and this message is coming with the help of this CSS. So that is how in our very first demonstration I've shown you one of the approach of creating the Angular components by opting for the option of inline templating. That means within the same TypeScript file you do the template body content like your HTML content, and also you take care of your CSS everything. So though this looks pretty simple, and but in real time obviously this may not be the ideal solution, is because if we take our HTML like this, or if we take our CSS like this, so you need to obviously make changes to the TypeScript file every time when some changes have to happen to the body or to the styles. So obviously the best solution is to take out this code from the template, put it in a separate HTML file, take out this code from the styles, and then put that into a separate CSS file. And that is what we call as a code behind component. In the next lecture, I'm going to show you how to change this code to make it a code behind component. In this demonstration, I'm going to explain to you how to create a code behind component. So first of all, I'm going back to my components folder, and then I'm going to create a subfolder. Let's call this as code behind component. And inside the code behind component, I'm going to create a new file. Let's call this as codebehind.component.ts. Just like how we did for the inline component, but this time the additional thing is I'm going to create codebehind.component.html and click on that folder before you create a new file. Be careful there. So I'm saying codebehind.component.css. So that is how I now have 3 different files for my component. In the earlier example, we did everything in a single TypeScript file, but this time the HTML body content will be inside the HTML file, all the CSS definitions will be in the CSS, and then the component creation will be inside the codebehind.component.ts. So what I'm going to do to save up some time, I can take the code from the inline component, sorry. So I'm going to take up this code as it is, and then I'm going to paste that inside my codebehind.component.ts. And I'm going to change this class name to code behind component, and the selector name I'm going to change this as code behind. Now interestingly, whatever I did in the template, I'm going to cut from here, and then I'm going to put that in the HTML page. Pretty simple. And whatever I did in the styles, I'm going to cut from here, and then I'm going to put that in the CSS file. So this is how we have simply modified our existing, my previous example to the code behind component. So of course you can have every property in different lines if you want to make your CSS code looks much better. And that is how we are done with our CSS stuff here. Perfect. So I'm also done with my HTML. In case if you wanted to have all the output that you're trying to give in the HTML page inside a container like div, yes, you can take a div tag, and then inside the div you can have all your code. Because at the end of the day, your component.html will be inserted inside the index.html. So the index.html will have HTML, head, body, all that stuff, unlike the HTML file of your individual component. So now let's go back to the code behind component.ts. So this time, as I said, it has to be template URL instead of just template. It should be like template URL, and then what's the name of the HTML file, and then you need to specify the style URL. So I can say style URLs is so and so. So that is how we're going to make this small change. Now inside the template URL, I'm going to say / what's my file name, code behind .component.html, and then the style URLs is / code behind .component.css. And because it is possible that you can have an array of style sheets, so you have to actually put this entire file name inside these square brackets, because in real time if you have another CSS file, then you can put comma and then you can specify the name of that CSS file as well. So that is how in this new example we now have successfully completed our code behind component, which is nothing but a special class which is being exported from here. And then it is having a simple property. We have imported the component interface from the Angular core module, and your Angular component class must be identified with add component decorator. And this is supposed to specify 3 different properties. How do you want your component to be used? What's the name you want to use? So I say app-code behind. As I said, the first word should be the root component name, which is app for us. And then the second word is obviously your child component. Then you specify the template URL, and then you specify the style URLs as an array of style sheets. So at this point of time, I'm done with my template URL. So if I can take you to my HTML page, this is the content we have, and then in the CSS, this is the content we have. So now I can take you to my app.module.ts. So just like how we imported last time the inline component, I'm going to import my code behind component, and also in the declarations you need to specify the code behind component. Now it is up to you now. Would you like to bootstrap multiple components at the same time, or would you like to just bootstrap the code behind component? Okay, maybe for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to use both of them. I'm going to bootstrap both the inline component as well as the code behind component. So after that, I will take you to my index.html, and here we have the app inline component. So after a horizontal line, I'm going to say app-code behind. So this name, whatever I'm giving here, is the same name that I have used here, app-code behind. Perfect. So now if I go for the ng-serve, my application is going to first execute this component, and then it is going to execute this component. So 2 components you will see on the same page. So let's try to build this once to see any compilation errors. If we have any errors, we'll try to fix it, and then we will try to do the ng-serve. So far our application is now having 2 different components. Okay, it looks like we have a small problem in the codebehind.component.ts file. So let me take you there. So I think this square brackets is an extra one, so I removed that. So let's go for the ng build one more time. So once this is successful, we'll go for the ng-serve. Okay, everything looks good now, so I'm going to say ng-serve, and as you know, it is going to host our application on a default port number called as 4200, and I can go back to my browser and I can refresh my page, and this time interestingly you can see this output is coming from the app.inline component, and this output is coming from the code behind component. Unfortunately, because I copy pasted my code, I didn't change the messages. So to make it look much better, I'm going to say this is my first code behind Angular component, and this is my first code behind Angular component. So we made those changes, and now it has refreshed everything. So I'm going to refresh. Now you can see this is the message I'm getting from the inline Angular component, and this is the message that I'm getting from the code behind component, and these 2 components are separated by a horizontal ruler. So that is how, when you're designing a single page application, your page is made up of multiple components. So this piece is coming from one component, and this piece is coming from another component. So that is how, in this example, I've shown you how you can do complete web page designing in a separate HTML page and complete CSS definitions in a separate CSS file. Instead of having everything in one single TS file, it is normally recommended to do all your CSS in a different file, all your web page designing in a different file, and simply refer to these 2 files using the add component decorator. So that is how I have shown you the code behind component. So here I created my own CSS file, I created my own HTML page, I created my own TS file, I have written this code. So we did so many things manually by ourselves to understand the process. But we don't have to really struggle like this. Instead, if you can take help of the Angular CLI, it actually creates the HTML file for you, the CSS file for you, the TS file for you, everything upfront for you so that it saves some time for us. So in the next lecture, I'm going to show you how I can recreate this component one more time by using the Angular CLI. In this lecture, I'm going to show you the third approach of creating the Angular components. In the previous two lectures, we've seen how to do that inline and how to do that code behind. So obviously this example is also going to create the code behind component. But the only difference that I'm going to show you right now is to create this new component using the Angular CLI. So when you do that, all these files, these folders, everything will come to you automatically, and you will also have the boilerplate code in the TypeScript file. So how do we do that? So I'm back in my same folder, and then I'm going to say ng generate, and then what is it you want to generate is a component, and what do you want your component name? Okay, let's call this as hello world component, and then I press enter. Now the Angular CLI is going to create my component. Now you can see there is a new folder called as hello world component, and when I expand this folder, you can notice here there is a CSS file, there is an HTML file, there is a TypeScript file for your components creation. Of course, we do have the spec.ts for the unit testing. In fact, the command prompt itself will show you that these are the 4 different files that actually got created. So surprisingly, you can see the message create for the first 4 for the HTML spec.ts for unit testing, the actual component TypeScript file, CSS file. Last time, if you remember, I was the one who was updating the app.module.ts by importing that component and specifying that in the declarations and specifying that in the bootstrap, all that stuff. So fortunately, the Angular CLI is intelligent enough to update our app.module.ts file as well. So now, first of all, let me take you to my hello world component.ts file. So notice here, because at the time of creating the component, I said ng generate component hello world component. I gave the word component by myself. So that was the reason why it is having the word component second time, because it has added the word component by itself. So you can avoid that by not typing the word component when you are creating the component. Anyway, because I did that already, I don't want to change it. But probably here I can just remove the class name to hello world component. So you can notice, just like last time, first it is importing the component, and of course we haven't spoken about the onInit yet, but we will be doing that pretty shortly. So this statement we have seen in the previous examples as well. And our class has been exported, and it is having a blank default constructor, and also it is having the ng onInit function. So we will understand the purpose of onInit, ng onInit, and then the constructor in the upcoming lectures. But for the time being, my focus is pretty much on the selector. So the default name that they gave it to the selector is app-hello world component. So you can notice Angular is intelligent enough to put a hyphen for every word as a separator. So it's called as a snake casing. And then the template URL is the component.html, and the CSS is the component.css. Notice the word component is existing twice. Don't get confused. Had I not given the word component here, you would have seen the component only for once. Now our job is to simply define a property here, just like how we did last time. So I'm having a property of the type string, and I'm going to simply specify, hey, I'm from hello world component. Nice. So now if I can go back to my HTML page, they're only giving one default message, hello world component works. If you want, what you can do, you can take the same HTML that we used in the previous two examples, just copy that here and paste it here. Perfect. And also you can go back to the CSS file from the previous example, and put that in the hello world component dot CSS. Nice. So we are now ready with the CSS. We are now ready with the HTML. We are also ready with our component TypeScript code. Now, surprisingly, if I can take you to the app.module.ts file, you can notice the hello world component has already been taken into references. And because I removed that second word of component, I have to remove that from here as well. So this was automatically done. This was automatically done. And of course, for Bootstrap, it is your choice. Would you like to bootstrap the hello world component also? Then you can simply copy that here and paste it here. Now you're going to bootstrap 3 different components. Now finally, back in my index.html page, so after my app-code behind component, let me take this selector name and I'm going to have it here. So now in a single index.html page, we are basically putting in, or we are embedding the inline component, the code behind component, as well as another code behind component, but that was created with the help of the Angular CLI. So it saves a lot of time if we stick to this approach. Of course, in real time or going forward in the entire course, I will stick to the third approach. But I didn't show you the third approach directly because you should know how to do this manually by yourself, or how to do everything in a single TypeScript file as well. Okay, now everything looks good to me now, so I can go back here. Then I can go for ng build. If you don't do ng build and if you do directly ng serve is going to build your solution and then serve it. But it's better that you first build it by yourself, and only if it is free from errors you actually serve it. So now I'm running the ng serve command, and now I can go back to my browser and I can refresh. Now this time you can see this is coming from the inline component. This is coming from the code behind component. This is also coming from the code behind component. Notice the message hello world component works. This is obviously coming from this one. So whatever I specified in the paragraph by default, that is coming here. So this output is actually coming from the third component. So that is how in this example, in a single HTML page, you're basically hosting 3 different components. So in this final lecture of this section, I'm going to talk about how do we nest the components. Notice so far in the index.html is hosting all these 3 different components. But what if you tell me that the index.html is only supposed to host my first component, but this component should host this one and this one should host this one. So that is what we call as nested components, or embedding the components in a hierarchical order. So if you really want to do that, it's pretty simple. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy this line, and I'm taking you to the app inline component, which is this one. So you can see in the case of inline component, we were just hard coding some messages here. But interestingly, I'm going to say app code behind / app code behind. So that means inside the inline component, I'm going to put my code behind component. Nice. Now similarly, I'm going to copy these 2 lines, and then I'm going to the code behind.html, and inside the code behind.html, I'm going to put the hello world component. So that is how, of course, I can actually comment these 2 lines. I'm not going to remove for your reference. I'm only going to comment by pressing Ctrl+K+C. So overall, if you can see, at this point of time, the index.html is only putting the app inline. Now Angular is going to put first this component. So it goes to the inline component, and then it renders these 3 messages, and then it understands it has to go into the code behind component. And when it goes to the code behind component, after it renders these 3 messages, it understands that it has to go into the hello world component. So that is how you have one parent and then one child, and then that child is a parent to the third component. So overall, in the index page, you are basically just having one component, but the output, I'm expecting the output will be coming from all the three components. Okay, so let's save everything, and I'm going to say save all, and then I'm going for the, okay, it looks like everything has been compiled successfully, and then I can say refresh. So that looks okay. So probably you may not understand. Okay, let me do that by myself. So I'm going to do ng-ser one more time. So even though the index.html is only hosting app inline, you are supposed to get the output from all the three components. So that basically proves that the nested components concept is indeed working. So you are getting the output from the inline Angular component, and you're also getting the output from the code behind Angular component, and also from the CLI code behind component. So that is how, in this example, I have shown you how to host or how to insert one component into another component. Inside the inline component, you are inserting the code behind component. Inside the code behind component, you're inserting the, or you're embedding the hello world component.